noticed that, as I think you have as well, that in the Therigatha, that when these bhikkhunis, Theris, are speaking about their ordination, their entry
Yeah.
into monastic life, none of them mention monks, bhikkhus, male
Right.
monks
Yes.
being involved in that. None of them mention dual ordination.
Yes.
A good number of them, those who do talk about it, other than Pada Kundala, who says that the Buddha gave her upasampada, her full ordination. Other than her case, all the others who mention it talk about other bhikkhuni teachers, whether they're talking
Yes.
about Patachara, who we talked about earlier, or whether they're talking about Mahapajapati, or the commentary says they're talking about her, or others. And even when we get into like going over to the Teri Apadana or some of the like Dhammapada, some of the commentaries, we find this like again and again. Even I was looking at the story of the, I don't know, Cambodia, Queen of Cambodia, or where she was, but Queen Anoja.
Okay.
And her story in the commentaries, then it appears a little bit differently in key points in several polytext commentaries, in terms of whether Upalawana is the one who, in the story, is said to have then been asked by the Buddha to be her preceptor, or to see to her and her very large company of 500 women to see to their ordination. It gets expressed a little bit differently, and yet there's this story once again of the women then going to the bhikkhunis for their ordination, and even our friend Venerable Damcho Diane Finnegan, then in her work with Tibetan translations of these texts of the Mula Sarvastivada, she got this same impression. It's like in these stories again and again, she saw the women going to and being ordained by the bhikkhunis. And so we've talked about this before. You've written about this in Bhikkhuni Vinaya studies and elsewhere. And for our after a decade check-in, I wanted to ask you about this part again, because I've been working with it again recently.
Yeah. So look, I since I did that, I haven't, I've been focusing on that area and haven't done a huge amount of extra research. But as far as I know, the findings that I was making then still seem to stand up. And this extra thing, extra findings that you're mentioning now seem to support that. So I would agree that, the general principle seems to be that the texts which were created by and handled by the monks offer one picture of the bhikkhunis' life, and those which express the perspective of the bhikkhunis themselves, especially the Therigatha, but also to some extent the Bhikkhuni Patimokkha, offer a somewhat different perspective, with some notable differences being things like restrictions on travel, the ordination being done by bhikkhunis or by bhikkhus, and a number of different things like that. Yeah.
I really agree with you about this, Bhante.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Go on. I was just going to say, there's also another interesting one which I've just been working on in the last week or so, on the Ayya rules.
Yes.
The Ayya rules, I've just written an article for, I won't mention it yet because I haven't got it back from the editor, so it might not get published, so we'll just wait before mentioning it. But the idea with the Ayya rules are kind of like a Me Too rule that we find in the Vinaya. And essentially what it says is that if a trustworthy lay woman accuses a monk of some kind of sexual misconduct, then that monk should be prosecuted according to that. So essentially it's saying that the woman's word should be taken seriously. And that is a kind of finding that's found throughout all of the different Vinayas. Now, but according to the details of it do vary a little bit. The wording in the Pali and the Sanskrit is a little bit different. The Pali says that if the monk acknowledges committing an offense, right, one of the three offenses, if the monk acknowledges committing an offense, or if or according to what that or according to what that trusty lay woman said. And the relationship between those two clauses is not entirely clear. The Sanskrit versions say something like, if the monk acknowledges it, and also according to anything whatsoever that trusty lay woman has said. So it's more emphatic about believing what the laywoman says. Uses yena instead of just yena, and it has the addition of punar. Then we find through the different interpretations that essentially it seems that the original intent of the rule was that the testimony of the laywoman herself would be enough to be able to find the monk guilty of that offense, which of course is a very unique situation in the Vinaya, because Vinayas normally require that the monastic confess. And so this seems to be not quite, it seems to be an exception to that. And then there's a long history within the exegesis of the rule. Even the old Vibhanga tends to water that down. The commentary waters it down. But curiously enough, what I noticed was that the Vinaya Mukha, the author of whom was the Thai Sangha and a member of the Thai royal family about 100 years ago, questioned those findings and basically reasserted that the original intent of the rule must have been that the testimony of the woman by herself was sufficient to convict the monk.
Interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. And this, of course, relates to that whole very problematic area when you have sexual violations or sexual assault or sexual impropriety of he said, she said. Like, how do you find the evidence for that? And, we know from all of the contemporary studies that the incidence of false accusations is extremely low. And maybe 2% or 4% or something according to different studies and different contexts. That a trustworthy laywoman, and again, another area where that has changed is the definition of a trustworthy laywoman. Like, what does that actually mean? According to the Vinaya itself, it seems that, she was somebody whose words could be believed, who had an accurate recollection of it and so on. Most of the Vinayas then define that as being that she must have been a stream enterer at least.
Right, I've seen that.
Yeah, except with the exception of the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya. And the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya essentially says that she's telling the truth, she's not lying, and that she be a reliable witness, that she's got an accurate recollection of what happened. And again, the Vinaya Mukha agrees with that reading of it. From a completely different background, not referring to the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, of course, but just purely looking at the Pali text itself.
Interesting.
So it is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So this definitely seems to be a case where there was a rule laid down by the Buddha, which presumably laid down by the Buddha, which gave a great deal of weight to the word of a woman who's making an accusation of sexual misconduct. And the overall tendency in the traditions was to water that down, but also we find other voices which contest that and which want to point back to the stronger sense, which was part of the original rule formulation.
Bhante, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but the story of Metteyya, the Bhikkhuni, there was a debate about this in Sri Lanka long ago. And
Metteyya Bhikkhuni?
Yes, and she had gotten pregnant, and then she was encouraged by two bhikkhus who are characterized as like bad bhikkhus to accuse an arahant of making her
Right.
pregnant. And
Right.
so then the case is brought up, and in Sri Lanka, this big debate came up because the version of the vinaya that the Mahavihara had and the version of the vinaya that the Abhayagiri Vihara had on this topic was different. And the Abhayagiri Vihara then they say that Mete was to be expelled due to her own admission, that is, her admission of sexual misconduct, whereas she had committed parajika, and so was no longer a bhikkhuni and should be expelled. Whereas the Mahavihara had a version that said that because the bhikkhu arahant in question was also asked, did you do this? And he replies, so like clearly and authoritatively, just very clearly, absolutely, absolutely impossible. And so the Mahavihara version said her accusation that she had put, that she should be expelled because of what he said. So he's an arahanta, and she's not right in the story. So that seems like, okay, the word of the arahanta, they should have the highest integrity. And yet he's a bhikkhu and she's a bhikkhuni. And what is, if we don't consider who is an arahanta in this case, what should the vinaya be? How should this precept be held?
Right.
And I personally feel like, what we've learned of the vinaya itself, as it's been passed down in the traditions that we have, actually it should have been the other way. She is a bhikkhuni, but her acknowledgement of her sexual misconduct should have been the reason for her being expelled, not just because a bhikkhu said, no, I didn't do it.
Right.
And so we see these things in dialogue over centuries.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, in that particular case is a slightly different case because it's the two parties to the sexual act, whereas in this case it's a witness to it in the Ayya case. So it's a little bit different, but similar principles. But that is interesting, and it's also interesting, I think, when interestingly unusual when the quality of being an Arya is invoked in these kinds of cases. And to me, this is kind of a red flag. Normally, we don't see that in Vinaya.
Right, exactly. Thank you for picking up on that point. And it comes up in the contemporary cases as well, of course, which I'm sure you're thinking of.
Yes,
when somebody who is a great master is accused.
That's right, yeah. So Vinaya, again, just for people who might not be so familiar with the background in the Vinaya, but the Vinaya is very flat. And the Vinaya, basically all of the monks and nuns within that community are treated completely equally. There's no kind of sense of seniority or hierarchy. There's a sense of respect for seniority, but in terms of the legal standing of each member of the community, each member is considered to be a citizen, a member of the community, a member of the Sangha, and is treated in exactly the same way. I mean, of course, there are some things like, seniority for becoming a teacher or something like that. But in terms of your basic rights and procedures within a community, we're all just Sangha and we're all treated in the same way. And so when you see that this particular case, which is particularly problematic for all of these reasons which we've been touching on, then invokes this like spiritualizing explanation, so-and-so can't be wrong because of their spiritual attainment, which conveniently we have no means of verifying, then that becomes a red flag to me.
Yeah, and one of the aspects of this is the rights and powers of women, whether they're lay women, and here we're talking about Buddhism, and faithful lay women, disciples of the Buddha, who may be even stream enterers or more than that, but not necessarily. And also bhikkhunis, as in the case of Metteyya. So this is actually the topic that I've been looking into further with regards to bhikkhunis and Bhikkhuni Ordination. Can you see this? Is it backwards?
It says, do bhikkhunis contain the potency of ordination transmission?
Yes.
If so, whence something the source?
Whence the source? There we go. So this is something that I was working with this last year, because it's a topic that's been coming up internally in our Bhikkhuni Sangha, growing Bhikkhuni Sangha, not only in the West, in fact, barely in the West, but more with the growing Bhikkhuni Sanghas in Asia.
Right.
And that is really the question of, where does the lineage come from? Is a bhikkhuni really just a female bhikkhu? Or is a bhikkhuni something else, again, something else unto herself that is other than that? And for ordination, it's still such a question, because especially I think like in Thailand, and for many people, the way it was passed down, and in Sri Lanka with what Mahinda Thera is quoted as saying, like, as a bhikkhu, like, it's not for us to do, oh great king, I will call upon my sister Sanghamita Theri, she will come and bring with her the bhikkhunis together with the southern branch of the
Right.
Bo tree. All of that. And so that then there's such a strong idea that it's like the bhikkhunis themselves are the holders and bearers of the authentic bhikkhuni lineage and power. And by power, I mean the potency or power or efficacy or agency to be able to authentically transmit the lineage and the ordination. And so is that held within the bhikkhunis, or is it held within the bhikkhus, or is it really the Buddha's power that was shared with the early bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, that then they themselves had the right and authorization to pass down to others? What I had wanted to share here was not from texts, but from inscriptions that have been found. And the voice of the inscriptions as compared to what we find in the texts is really interesting. So would you like to try? No, I'll let you do that. I have an injury to my shoulder, so we'll see if she's able to do this. Can you see that, Bhante? Is it backwards or?
I honestly can't see it really clearly enough to be able to say. Let's assume that you can see it, and we'll add it on the screen share later on.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to have to put on my glasses. But we're talking about here Kanaganahali, the Mahastupa at Sanati. And this is from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century of the Common Era. And these inscriptions actually depict 2 types of monastic discipleship for women within these early inscriptions. And one of them records the gift of the bhikkhuni Nagoya, the female monastic disciple of the noble Thera, Visirakita. So she's a bhikkhuni and she has a male teacher. And then there's another. This is the gift of Vidhi, female monastic disciple of the female teacher, Himarakita. And not only here, but in other places. Yes.
Himarakita.
Yes.
Presumably Himalayan then.
You know, then there's another from the same Kanaganahali, and more inscriptions here. And then this is dated quite precisely. And we find the name of the Chaitya is the Tathaloka Chaitya Dhamma Rajaka. And we're in the reign of Vashishtiputra Sri Pulmavi, 120 CE. So this one is nice because it's so precisely dated and gives you a lot of information. And her inscription here says then, success, homage to the blessed, perfectly enlightened one of the great Adhalaka Chaitya. And I'm going to then abbreviate. And agarako and covering with slabs are the pious gift of the bhikkhuni. And here it specifically says she's a bhikkhuni, Dhammasiri, together with my parents and my preceptor. It says specifically Upajaya, Venerable Bhadanta Varanabhuti. This is a bhikkhu.
Okay. Okay.
And my acharya, that's her teacher, then Bhadanta Siha, again a bhikkhu, for the well-being and happiness of all beings. And so then this particular inscription is interesting because it's very, it has a lot of explicit information, which in some other cases you have to guess exactly what's going on. So Bhante, the point is here in this that from the inscriptions, it seems that the people who were the preceptors and the teachers understood that it can come through both, either way. They are all good in some.
Can I just say thank you so much for that? It's
Thank
been
you,
wonderful.
Bhante.
I feel like
We've
talked about so many interesting things. We should have talked about Bhadda some more, but anyway, maybe another time. But anyway, and I've learned so much from discussing with you, as I always do. So this is very, very wonderful to hear. And look, and just to sort of comment on what you're saying there with the Bhikkhuni inscriptions and so on. I mean, and that's such an important thing, because this is giving that sense of boldness and confidence about the bhikkhunis in their actions, that they are there leading communities, bringing people together, working positively for the Sangha, so with major donors and supporters, and playing this very active and positive role within the community, which we can see in terms of positive actual records throughout the course of Indian Buddhism. And the records you refer to there are, of course, not isolated. There are many other cases. And so this, again, I think, to me, harks back to the point that I made earlier, that our Buddhist tradition, and the point that you made as well, is that our Buddhist tradition is very broad, and that there's a very large and complex concept, large and complex context within which the Buddhist traditions have been inherited, and which have informed people's lives in different ways. And for me, if we think of that concept of the Bhikkhuni lineage, and you were asking the Bhikkhuni lineage and the potency of it, to me, of course, the most important thing is the practice of the Dhamma, and for people to live accordance with that. And if we look in the way that the vinaya handles ordination, it's not really concerned with questions of lineage and all of these kinds of things. It's concerned with how people live. It's concerned with supporting human beings to be able to live the holy life, providing them an education, providing them requisites, providing them emotional support and spiritual support and teachings, and giving people the opportunity to live the holy life. And so I think that's the important thing that to keep a focus on.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Anumodami. Well said, well said. Thank you very much, Bhante.